Welcome to Secret Story. Dear friends, thank you very much for watching. Leave comments, put likes, share with friends and subscribe to the channel. Here is a new standalone story. Thanks for bearing with us. We have many more to catch and new ones, so keep reading. Thanks for your loyalty. Like and comment. But most of all enjoy, and Shelley's heart froze as she stared at him with wide eyes, Connor only seemingly a little more relaxed. She stared in shock at her husband, who smiled at her in the doorway, waiting for the end of her marriage. However, that moment never came. After that slightest of moments, Hayden grinned as he looked at the two of them, much to Shelley and apparently Connor's astonishment. I take it you two haven't been decorating much? Except each other, then, he said with open amusement, and Shelley's eyes flicked to Connor's, who was apparently as stumped as she was. And then Hayden's words dawned on her. He had said, decorating each other. Not how Connor had decorated her. It was then that Shelley suddenly noticed the paint-filled water that was covering Connor. She looked down at the mix of blobs of the same white paint water that he had flung at her earlier and knocked all over and around her just then. The two, while not the same color or texture, and definitely not the same taste or temperature, must have looked similar enough from Hayden's perspective. So, with the two together, he obviously thought that what covered her and what she held cupped in her hands, and soaked her face, hair, skin and clothes, was all from the paint water. Relief suddenly flooded through the stunning brunette wife of 3 weeks. All he thought was that the two had had a paint fight, which they had, and that he had caught them covered in the stuff. And that obviously from the state of her, Connor had won. Hayden's friend was only a moment behind her in clocking on to what Shelley's husband meant. That he suddenly broke out in a grin. That was when Shelley once more felt guilt envelope her, as she watched Connor and Hayden grin boyishly. She had actually cheated on Hayden. On her husband. On the man she had only married a few weeks ago, who she had been with for 5 years before, and all the while Hayden was unaware of what he was looking at. While Connor seemed to not feel guilty at all. And she had felt relief at not having gotten caught. Hayden had every right to hate her, and all she could think of was herself, but, oh, she loved him with all of her heart, and she hadn't been herself, she hadn't been in control, it had all just happened. If she could go back, she would. Stopping, Shelley realized that she was trying to rationalize the whole thing away. Oh, but it would destroy Hayden to know. And he didn't now. And he didn't have to. If she never told him, then surely everything would be alright from then on. Telling him would only hurt him, and there was nothing she could do about it. All of these thoughts blinked through the beautiful brunette's mind. Shelley looked between her husband and the man. What was she going to do? Yeah, Shelley decided to start a paint fight. But she didn't realize who she was messing with. Connor joked in reply to Hayden, in the tone he always had. Hayden grinned amusedly, and adjusted the bag under his arm awkwardly, eyeing her amusedly at the obvious proof of Connor's statement that he had won. So much for decorating, babe, he asked her with an amused grin, and all Shelley could do was smile carefully. Hayden would surely question why she had paint water in her mouth. She gave it her best shot, man. But in the end I think I was too much for her, Connor replied to his friend. Shelley shot him a dangerous glance, which Hayden, thankfully, took as a sign she didn't want to be outdone. Though it did make him ask her a question. It seems Connor here decorated you pretty good, babe. You didn't let him, did you? Her loving, sweet husband asked, obviously meaning did she let him win. She stared at him, unsure of what to say or do. It was kind of a surprise, she replied finally. And her heart beat rapidly at the sound of her own voice. I don't think she expected me to cover her in so much. So quickly, Connor added, with a sly grin at her. Hayden simply laughed, unaware. Shelley stared at him, wondering how he could be so carefree after what they had just done. Well, at least you had fun while I was out, Hayden said amusedly. Despite the total guilt the wife felt, Shelley couldn't help but think that her husband had no idea how relevant his words were. Connor's smile, however, said that Hayden really had hit the nail on the head. So to speak, for Shelley's part she simply gave her sweet husband a weak smile. It was then that Hayden suddenly remembered the bag under his arm. Anyway, I brought food, he said, sounding more than a little pleased with himself, and the gloss. The paint is in the back of the car. But I suggest we eat while everything's still hot. Connor voiced his approval to this, clapping his hands together. Though I think you should get cleaned up a bit first, babe, her loving husband said to Shelley as he held back an obvious chuckle. Shelley's cheeks turned bright red at her husband's smile. What the hell was she going to do with that? Yeah, I will, she replied in as steady, normal voice as she could, trying hard to appear as if nothing were wrong at all. You two should go ahead. I'll get cleaned up and meet you in the kitchen. She added a forced smile to try to sell that idea. At least then she could find a way of dealing with what she held in her hands. Hayden smiled at her. About to reply, no doubt with some caring comment, when Connor, grinning amusedly, folded his arms and spoke up first. I mean, it's only paint and water at the end of the day. And you'll be having a shower later. Why get cleaned up now when you'll only get covered with more paint later? Her husband's friend asked, and Shelley stared at him wide-eyed that he was suggesting, in front of Hayden it would be so naughty after all. However, it was the unanswered question of the possible insinuation that hung in the air that set her heart beating faster. What did he mean that she will only get covered with more paint later? Surely, he wasn't. No. No, he may not feel guilty but he wouldn't seriously think that this would happen again, no. He must have actually meant it literally, so as to make it sound a more convincing proposition to get Hayden's agreement. Which from the amused glint in her husband's eye, Shelley thought it may have. However, Connor grabbed one of the spare painting sheets from the corner and moved toward her. For all appearances he moved as if he were simply swaggering as the winner of a paint fight. Come on, Shelley, the food will be cold, he began, as if he were going to hand her the sheet. However, as he got close enough, Shelley opened her mouth to say, thanks, but then Connor moved as swift as a snake, slapping her hand from underneath with a grin. Too slow, Shelley gave a surprised shout the moment Connor hit her hands towards her. And everything happened at once. Wiping her eyes with her, Shelley stared at the two men as they laughed amusedly. Connor. You! Shelley exclaimed, not exactly angry with him, but more in surprise at what he had done. This, however, made Hayden and his friend laugh even more. Looks like he got you again, babe, Hayden said amusedly, though with more than a hint of deep affection. How could she tell him? And why was Connor so okay with it all? No. More than okay. Joking about it all. Hayden, can I have that sheet now? Unless you want me sitting here drenched in paint and water, she asked. Hayden smiled as he nodded to Connor, who smiled to himself smugly as he tossed the sheet to her. Shame we don't have a camera, he said as he looked, as if all innocently joking, between Hayden and her. Shelley picked up the sheet and began wiping. I would have loved a picture of that. Then she stood up and wiped her hands, looking around the floor before she looked up at the two men opposite her, who were watching amusedly. What a mess, she commented as she eyed the room. That's what you get for, Connor replied. Shelley didn't miss the insinuation at the end. Shelley mock frowned as she threw the sheet at Hayden's friend, who deflected it away with an amused laugh. She still felt guilty, even if Connor didn't. But until she decided what she was going to do, she had to appear as if everything was normal. Come on you two, let's eat, Hayden said with a grin, as he half turned in the doorway. We've still got plenty of decorating to do. Of the house, not each other, he added with amusement. And as Connor laughed, Shelley smiled faintly, part of her finding his teasing amusing though the guilt still outweighed it all. All right, I'm starving, Connor replied, patting his stomach. After a workout like that I need to recuperate some energy, he added, apparently meaning the paint fight. Though Shelley was all too aware of what her husband's friend really meant, clearing her throat, which felt a little sore, Shelley took a deep breath. You didn't buy me too much, did you, Hayden? Shelley asked. As she concentrated on not concentrating on the two feelings, and then added without thinking, because I'm not too hungry now. The words left her mouth without thought, though they were completely true. And from the sudden amused smile on Connor's face, Shelley realized why. The beautiful brunette wife's cheeks reddened once again as she looked from Connor to Hayden. Just eat what you like, babe, he replied warmly, "Yeah," was all Connor said. Hayden had done himself proud, as usual, with what he had bought back for them. Though Shelley had been telling the truth when she had said she wasn't too hungry. And so, while Hayden ate happily, and Connor ate hungrily, obviously not lying about needing to recuperate after the energy he had used. Shelley only ate a small amount. The other reason was because her mind was thinking hard on what she should do. And that made her appetite vanish completely. And so, the three of them ate. And all the while Shelley chimed in every now and then to prevent her sweet, loving husband thinking there was something wrong, while she racked her brain trying to think of what to do. If she told Hayden he would never forgive her, yep, that would hurt him and ruin their marriage, which had only just started. And after 5 years too. Or she could not tell him. At least that way he wouldn't get hurt. Though how she could handle carrying around this huge amount of guilt she had no idea. Not to mention that she had cheated on him. Whether he knew or not, did it matter still? Maybe she could just forget it had ever happened, and telling him would only hurt him and make things worse. She hadn't been able to help herself. And it wouldn't happen again. It was just an accident, and so, Shelley's thoughts went on, rationalizing as much as she could until she straightened and determinedly squashed the guilt inside her. It hadn't been her fault. It had just happened. And it wouldn't do any good now. And it wouldn't happen again. So, it was best just not to say anything. Hayden smiled and gave her a hug as his friend went to get the paint from the back of the car. As Connor returned, placing the paint in what would be the lounge. Shelley tried vainly to adjust her painting shirt. As Hayden went to put the wood gloss in the lounge, Shelley retied her ponytail from the mess Connor had made of it before following, leaning against the doorframe. She watched the two men eye the room for where to paint next. All as if nothing had happened from the moment they had entered earlier. Shelley thought that if she was going to pull this off, she had to think that nothing had happened either. Clear thoughts, clear thoughts. "Will you two be alright finishing off in here, or do you need any help?" she asked calmly. "No, we're good, babe," Hayden answered, as he looked at her over his shoulder, his tone warm and soft. "You go finish your room. I know you want it done." Shelley smiled lovingly at her husband. He knew her so well, before she once more stamped down the feelings and images in her mind. Though she did manage to keep a serene face as she blew him a kiss and made her way back into the room next door, the light streamed through as the sun stood proud in a blue sky spotted with fluffy white clouds. Shelley smiled at the scene through the large French doors. She did have to really stamp out the images that instantly flooded back into her mind when she entered the room. The room was a mess. She grabbed one of the sheets, and wiped up the floor from the paint water, before filling the water pot up again. As she did, the brunette wife hoped that one day she would be able to walk into this room without seeing that scene flash into her mind. If not, she would never be able to look as if everything was normal. She was right though, telling Hayden would only make things worse now. For a while Shelley thought that she might actually pull it off. The banter and laughter from the other room, and the sound of the radio playing, soon helped take the newlywed wife's mind off what had happened. And the soothing act of painting the wall white seemed to help her relax and forget that she had anything to feel guilty for. It was the only thing she could do after all. It was. In fact, it all went so well that when Connor called through to ask if she wanted a coffee as well, Shelley didn't even think of what had happened as she replied that she would. "Alright, man, I'll leave yours in the lounge," Connor said, as Hayden nodded and continued through the house to the bathroom. Taking the mug he had used for Shelley's coffee in his hand, he carefully made his way through into the room where his friend's stunning wife was finishing off painting the wall. As he entered, however, Connor stood for a moment and let himself drink in and appreciate the sudden sight that filled his eyes. It was strange in a way though, Connor thought, as he watched Shelley continue to paint, unaware of his presence in the doorway. He should feel guilty for what they had done earlier. Hayden was his longtime friend after all. And they had been through so much together. Not to mention that he knew how much his friend loved Shelley and how much she loved him too, in fact, quite the opposite. He still thought of Hayden as his dear old friend. The question was, would Shelley? Oh, she had been more than enthusiastic earlier. More than by far. And it had been her who first brought up the fact that she was cheating on Hayden. But that had been in the midst of unexpected. Since then she had had a clear mind. Well, there was only one way to find out. "Want your coffee on the table?" Shelley heard Connor ask from behind her. She felt her heart leap from surprise. She hadn't heard him come into the room. Turning to look over her shoulder at him and smiling, Shelley nodded gently, still holding the brush above her head. "Yeah, thanks," she said, her mind still silent and serene. Connor smiled and walked over, placing the mug on the table behind her before putting his hands half in his pockets and watching her from behind a moment. Shelley was about to ask him where Hayden was when Connor spoke first. "Connor," she said finally, "you shouldn't do that. I'm married to your friend, remember?" "Yeah, I remember you telling me that," her husband's friend replied, and Shelley remembered that she had more than once said about being married while, "Connor, that was a mistake. You know that," she said in a weak tone, her heart warring with the guilt. "It had been wrong. Let's just forget it happened. Please." Connor remained silent for a moment. "If that's what you want, Shelley," he said in a surprisingly considerate tone, and Shelley felt her heart pumping hard in her chest. "Don't forget your coffee." And with that her husband's friend gave her a half smile. Then he walked out of the room calling for Hayden to hurry up so that they could get some work done. Bantering as usual, Shelley stood there for a moment, her heart pulsing furiously. She loved Hayden, yes, it may have worked as well. It started to anyway. However, Connor seemed to have different ideas. A little while after her husband's friend had left the room, Shelley had finished her coffee and had gone to wash the mug. When she noticed Hayden and Connor sitting drinking theirs, neither noticed her as she lingered by the doorway. However, in the light and from the angle she had caught sight of them at, Shelley could see her handsome husband's back while Connor sat facing her on an angle, and for a few seconds Shelley stared, unable to tear her eyes away. Not long after that, Hayden called to her to come and give her opinion on some new idea he had for the lounge. Standing there, feet away from his friend, whose eyes watched her with deep and open interest, Shelley's heart continued to race. And that was even though she tried hard to keep her mind on what her sweet husband was saying. However, for a few moments Hayden left the room to go pick some wood railing he had left in one of the other rooms. He was gone less than a minute. However, in that minute and the moment his feet left the door, Connor moved closer to her. "Connor," Shelley said warningly. "You're beautiful, Shelley," he replied as if not hearing her tone. His eyes seemed sincere, as if he meant nothing more than the compliment. When suddenly the two of them heard Hayden approaching, things only got worse from then on. The next time, Shelley had offered to make coffee, and was in the kitchen when suddenly she felt a pair of strong hands. Her heart leapt as she could still hear Hayden singing along to the radio in the room next door. Shelley managed to keep herself quite composed this time. "Connor, would you mind?" she asked, insinuating that she wanted space. "I don't think your friend would like you pressing your—" She altered her words as a very clear image flashed into her mind. "He wouldn't be best pleased seeing you like this." "What about you?" her husband's friend asked, though despite, at first, not knowing what to answer, she still managed to remain determined. "I love Hayden," she said simply, meaning it for the obvious answer it was. "I know. But you still haven't said you mind," he replied smugly, and as his words settled in Shelley's mind Shelley breathed harder, her mind racing at Connor's words. She did love Hayden. But she hadn't said she minded. Why? She glanced over her shoulder quickly. However, Connor was already disappearing through the doorway and heading back through to where her husband was. While his actions hadn't been anything obviously inappropriate, they were still not exactly something a guy's friend should be doing to his friend's wife. Or, for that matter, something a newlywed wife should be letting her new husband's friend do to her. However, emboldened by her lack of direct resistance, despite her heartfelt protests, Connor grew more daring. Once, as she was bending over to pick up the paint to start on the wood around the room with the French doors, Connor suddenly came up behind her. Shelley, both shocked by the brazenness of Hayden's friend, quickly straightened and backed away from him. "That's something you'll never know," she said as calmly and confidently as she could, trying to redress the balance. She had to show him she didn't want him to keep this up. It wasn't fair on Hayden. Would she have minded though if it had been fair? Was that the only reason? Did she like his attention? No, she was married to his friend. A small, amused and smug smile lifted the corner of Connor's lips, his eyes smiling also as if he were enjoying a chase. Amused at getting one over her, Connor once more let his eyes wander over her completely before he turned to go. Letting herself calm down for a moment, Shelley quickly grew determined to not let him affect her like that again, more wary. Shelley felt pleased with herself as she calmly managed to avoid a few more times Connor tried it on with her. Though she found it slightly confusing when she saw how, surely not jealous, Connor became of her attention. Part of her hoped that seeing her with her husband, his friend, would make Connor realize it was he that she loved. However, Connor was not to be outdone. And Shelley noticed that the more she managed to avoid him, the more determined her husband's friend became. However, that moment spurred Connor on. And once again he managed to catch Shelley while she made coffee. Her heart raced again as she heard Hayden in the next room. "Connor, I'm your friend's wife," she said. As she looked into his eyes and gently pushed him back. "Does that mean it's wrong for me to imagine whether these counters would be strong enough?" he asked. Shelley's cheeks reddened again. "No," she answered honestly. She pushed the images from her mind forcefully and took a hold of his wrists. She spoke with resolve, "But it does mean you shouldn't try to find out. Just tell me to stop and I'll stop," her husband's friend said with more than a hint of confidence in his voice. Shelley felt her heart pounding as she looked into his eyes, held his hands towards him and, with a little forcing perhaps, said, "Stop." Suddenly Hayden called from the other room, snapping out of the moment. Shelley smiled and shook her head. She knew now that she was in control of herself. "Behave," she said, as she moved and walked out of the kitchen, not noticing the small smile on Connor's face as he watched her go. Ignorant of why he seemed amused at it was for that reason, that 20 minutes later, Connor left Hayden painting the window frames in the lounge and came to stand in the doorway as Shelley painted the wood around the wall white in her room. "Hello," her husband's friend suddenly said in a low voice from behind her. "Connor, we can't keep doing this," Shelley began to say. "You're right," he replied just as lowly, his expression one of a naughty boy doing something he shouldn't. Why did that send butterflies into Shelley's stomach? And why was he talking so quietly? This tension is getting too much. "Connor," she began again, however Hayden's friend cut her off. "You really are beautiful, Shelley," he said. The sudden change in his brazenness was so unexpected that Shelley didn't know what to do for a moment. "Connor, I'm your friend's wife," she said. The sudden mentioning of her husband's name brought Shelley sharply back into reality. "Hayden," she said, sounding as if she had just been woken up with a bucket of ice water. "Connor, where's Hayden?" "He's painting next door," he replied calmly. "Hayden." Connor called. "Yeah." Shelley heard her sweet husband call back. "How you getting on, man?" Connor asked. "Not much to go now, mate." Shelley listened as Hayden, her husband of only a few weeks, "How's Shelley getting on?" "She's on fire, man," Connor replied to. Hayden was oblivious to how true his friend's words were. "Connor," Shelley whispered so Hayden wouldn't hear. Suddenly, however, Shelley heard Hayden's phone ring. "1sec Connor," Hayden called, before Shelley heard him answer the phone. "Sure thing," Connor replied, before he lowered his voice so only Shelley could hear him. "I think Shelley wants my attention anyway." "Connor, I love Hayden," she began, feeling as if she had said the same thing countless times before, "and you're his friend." Connor replied, "I know you do, Shelley. You two make a great couple," he said, as he stared deep into her eyes. "Hayden and I only got married 3 weeks ago, Connor." "You were at our wedding?" she asked disbelievingly. Her heart skipped a beat as she actually said the words. She couldn't believe she was having this conversation with her husband's best friend. "Connor," Shelley said negatively, "just say you don't want, and I'll stop," he said. "I love Hayden," she replied, trying determinedly. Connor smiled, and Shelley was unsure why, while her mind shouted stop. It was then that Shelley realized she was losing control of herself and the situation. She opened her mouth to say they had to stop. However, different words came out. Connor, Hayden's next door. We can't, she began, I'm going to have to head out. Her husband of a few weeks called back, and even in her preoccupied state, Shelley could tell that he was searching for something next door, no doubt his keys. Hayden walked through into the doorway that he was completely unaware of his wife's previous situation. It took a moment for her to gather her thoughts. What's up, man? Connor asked, beating her to the question. That was my dad. He and my brother need some help with that work at home. Hayden replied to both of them. Shelley nodded, remembering through her rather unsettled state what her husband's father had said earlier that day. I won't be long though, babe. That last was added for Shelley. Oh, Shelley said a little dejectedly. Do you have to go, babe? The stunning brunette wife added, thinking that with Hayden around her Connor wouldn't try anything on again. She hoped, anyway. I won't be long, he replied caringly, they really need my help. But what about decorating? She asked, trying to think of some way to make her husband stay. Shelley didn't trust his friend without him there. Did she trust herself now? You and Connor can carry on without me. I'll help when I get back, he answered, as he walked over and kissed her gently, unaware that his friend had been doing just that not long ago. Shelley knew there was no way of talking Hayden out of it. And if today had been any normal day she wouldn't have thought twice about him going to help his family, but right then she really wanted him to stay. No, she really needed him to. But she couldn't exactly tell him why. Oh, honey, I don't want you to go help your family as your friend might try something on with me while you're not here. But then, he had started it all. Did that excuse her though? Nodding slightly, Shelley resigned herself to the fact that she was going to have to deal with Connor on her own. Take as long as you need, Connor said in a tone that Hayden would have only thought of as his usual confident self. Hayden nodded with a small smile, and Shelley returned it with a forced one of her own. Before he gently kissed her again. Then turned to head out the room. The moment Hayden's back was turned, Shelley felt Connor move closer. And as her husband of a few weeks turned into the hall and headed towards the front door, disappearing out of sight, Shelley turned abruptly to finally tell his friend to stop as he had asked her. I'll see you soon, her sweet, loving husband called from up the hall. Bye, baby. I love you, Shelley answered half rapturously, and then, Shelley heard the door close behind Hayden. Her husband of only a few weeks. The man she loved. The man she wanted to spend her whole life with and raise a family with. They were actually trying for right then. It was then that Shelley realized she had given in. Mr. Hayden Winters walked calmly and happily from the front door to his car, tossing his mobile onto the passenger seat as he climbed in and looked up at the sky. He figured that the best hours of daylight were behind the day, and in an hour or so the sun would start to set. Where had the day gone? Are you sure you want, Shelley? Connor asked, more rhetorically now than serious. I'm not Hayden, you know. Stop teasing me, Connor, she said, the knowledge that this was her husband's friend, that she had only been married 3 weeks, that she was actually, and really, cheating on Hayden, who was now not in the house. This was the house her and Hayden were trying to start a family in. For what seemed like an eternity, the newly married Hayden Winters drove casually along the slowly winding down streets. Winding down in both hours of the day and the day's activities that all of the residents of the city had been up to. He tapped the wheel in time with a catchy tune he had never heard before on the radio, absolutely oblivious to the day's activities that his wife been up to in his absence earlier. Oh, but as the beautiful scenery of the city began to brighten mischievously into the playfulness that the nightlife would bring, Hayden made his way to his family's house. Hayden placed down the coffee cup and glanced at his watch before nodding to something his brother said. He glanced at all they had accomplished so far. It was almost done now. Hopefully, it shouldn't take too much longer. As he, his father, and his brother each raised a resigned eyebrow at what they had to redo all over again, the three of them finally got back to where they should have been, though this time quicker now they knew what had to be done. And so, Hayden continued working. Shelley smiled and glanced around the room. They hadn't done anything since Hayden had been gone. I guess we didn't get much done, she commented amusedly, as she looked around. Oh, I don't know about that, Connor teased playfully with that smile of his. I guess you're right, she replied with a pleased smile, though you've certainly decorated me today. "So, when's Hayden going to be back, you think?" he asked. "I don't know. Could be any time," she answered honestly. She didn't even know how long they had been going at it. It seemed like hours. "So, when?" he asked, and Shelley smiled even more amused. "You do remember that I'm your friend's wife?" she asked, and he nodded simply. Again, he nodded, and Shelley laughed lightly. "When Hayden's not about to walk in," she replied honestly. With that last, Connor's smile deepened. He nodded. Besides, it had happened now, there was no turning back. And if Hayden didn't know, then he wouldn't be hurt. The gorgeous wife's rationalizing, however, was abruptly cut short as she heard her phone ringing. Looking around for it on the table, Shelley glanced and noticed the LED flashing on the floor, and while she had clung to the table for support, heading around and picking it up, the brunette wife answered and smiled. She heard Hayden's voice on the other end. Hayden smiled as he heard his wife's sweet voice answer the phone. A warm feeling flooded through him like always, but, of course, the loving husband of only a few weeks didn't know that. And so, he smiled deeper as the feeling swept through him. "Hey. I just thought I'd let you know that I've got a few more things to sort out over here. But I shouldn't be too long, hopefully," the recent groom said caringly, as he leaned back against the kitchen counter in his parents' house. It wouldn't be his much longer. Not once his and Shelley's new place was finished. "That's good. I've missed you," his sweet wife replied warmly. "You sound happy," he asked sweetly and smiled deeper at his wife's reply. "Because I'm happy to hear your voice," Shelley answered truthfully. "When will you be back?" she added with open interest. "Should be about half an hour or so. Just finishing up," he answered, as he glanced back at the work he and his family had been working on. That was when Hayden heard his wife suddenly giggle playfully. "You all right?" he asked with an amused grin, as he looked around again and grabbed the beer his father had left for him, though Hayden just thought she was avoiding replying while Connor was around. "So, did you get much done? Or have you both been paint fighting again?" he asked again with playful amusement, before shaking his head to his brother's question of if he wanted a ride home. Again, Shelley laughed playfully. Though it wasn't because of his question, as the husband of 3 weeks thought. But more because of the pleasure of his friend biting her impressive cleavage and neck. "No. No, paint fighting, baby," his wife answered. She shook her head with a teasing smirk, before holding her hand up to him to show him her wedding ring. Connor shouted something in the background, though Hayden couldn't tell what he had said. Which was just as well. Shelley, however, did. "Shut up," Hayden's wife shouted playfully after gasping. "No, we've been busy. We've been at it since you left," Hayden nodded as he swallowed the mouthful of beer. Then he looked around, nodding to his father as he came in with the last part that they needed from the garage. "All right then. Listen, hun, I'm going to have to go. Dad's here and I'm almost finished. So, I'll see you soon." "Yeah," he said, and heard Shelley mumble something at Connor before she came back onto the phone. "Sure. Hurry home, babe," she replied caringly, and Hayden felt that warm sensation flood through him again. "I love you." "Love you too," he said in reply. Wife had thrown a paintbrush at him with a shocked smile. "And of the Connor we have to stop," that she had mumbled no. As Hayden set back to work, happy that it was almost done, he remained blissfully unaware. While the phone had been a rather challenging affair, she told Connor that they really had to get some decorating done. Other than her, that was. Or Hayden was going to wonder what they had been up to, however long it had been, and so, understanding the implications, and that if he ever wanted again he would do it her way, Connor had quickly agreed, and so, the two set about actually finishing the room off, which surprisingly they managed to almost do. By the time Hayden came back, they probably would have finished too. Unbeknownst to the illicit pair, Hayden's car had pulled up onto the driveway. And as Connor spoke, and Shelley laughed lightly, about to reply, the two of them heard the door close behind Hayden as he walked in. She smiled and threw her arms around her loving husband to hide her appearance a moment. Hopefully, if he noticed the state of her clothes. She hoped anyway. Hey, her sweet husband replied. I haven't been gone that long. I know, she replied. Her eyes sparkled with both love and being shocked by what had just happened, but I just missed you. Can't a wife miss her husband, Hayden grinned and held up his hands as if in surrender, and Shelley laughed lightly as his arm went around her waist. Wow, you have got a lot done, he said, as he glanced around the room. Then he noticed the wet door and suddenly checked his arm in case he had brushed up against it. Which he hadn't, luckily. We put in a lot of effort, the two of us, Connor commented with a knowing smile, and Shelley felt her cheeks redden some more at the hidden meaning, though Hayden didn't pick it up at all as he nodded, so I see. If we keep this up the whole house will be done in no time, Hayden said, as he grinned at the both of them. Especially if I give you a hand, Connor replied, sounding for all the world as if he was offering out of the kindness of his heart, the extra help will get it finished in no time. And I'm free, if you want me. Sounds good. What do you think? Hayden asked her. Nodding to his friend, Shelley looked over to Connor, who grinned with what she knew was implication. Oh, he had meant the fact that he was free as an implication that she wasn't. That she was married. But, she wasn't going to let him be in charge. He has some uses, she conceded with a pleased smile, as Connor raised his eyebrows. I'm sure I could find something for him to do. Maybe. Shelley emphasized that last word, and Connor smiled. All right then. That's all settled. What do you say we call it a night and head out to get something to eat? Hayden asked, beaming with both love and happiness at her. Food it is, Connor agreed, rubbing his hands together. Hayden laughed, obviously thinking his friend was just bantering about how much more stamina he had in decorating. Which Shelley thought was true in a way. And so, the three, laughing and joking, placed the brushes in the spirits and closed the pots before heading out of the house. Hayden Winters was completely oblivious to any of the implications his wife or friends secretly made to each other the rest of the night. Oh, it was a very good night indeed. The newly married Mrs. Shelley Winters slept soundly that night. After all of her hard work and exhaustion that day, it was 2 weeks later, however, before the new house was finally fully decorated. Walls, wood, carpets, and furniture, all done, and in those whole 2 weeks, though Connor had stuck to his word and been around whenever they were decorating. However, 2 weeks passed, and Connor and Hayden were sitting relaxing on the couch in the lounge, sweating and panting heavily from all the moving they had done that day. But, did the place look incredible? It had been a true labor of love. For Connor and Shelley that one night especially. And it had all paid off in the end, even if it had taken longer than expected. Still, it was done now, and Connor and Hayden cracked open a beer, clanking their bottles together as they leaned back into the plush couch. They stretched out their legs and groaned in relaxation, finally glad to have nothing more to do that day. The door closing announced that Shelley had come back from wherever it was that she had gone. And Hayden waited with a grin as he looked to his friend, who gave him the same look. She had headed out early that morning and the two of them had rushed to get most of the house finished. And now Hayden was looking forward to seeing what his wife thought of the house. They had made a home for themselves and their family. Shelley didn't take long coming in. He knew then that they had done a great job. Well, he asked, as he cast a hand around to indicate what they'd done to the place. Well. She answered with a barely contained smile, I'm pregnant. The sound of the two men's jaws dropping at the same time could have been heard around the neighborhood. No doubt, however, it didn't take Hayden long to jump out of his seat. His bottle falling to the floor and miraculously not tipping over, as he bounded over to her. Connor simply sat and stared in utter amazement as he watched the pair. The same thought flashing through his mind that had gone through Shelley's when she had first suspected and then found out, who had knocked her up. Was it her husband? Or was it his friend? Staring deep into his friend's eyes, Connor hoped that it was Hayden's baby, and that was only the beginning. As for the child, well, that would be telling. The end. Copyright 2024, all rights reserved. No part of this story can be reproduced in any form or by any electronic or mechanical means without written permission from the author. All characters are fictitious, and any similarity to actual people, living or dead, events, or locales is entirely coincidental unless otherwise state. Dear friends, thank you very much for watching. Leave comments, put likes, share with friends and subscribe to the channel.